us interested in this topic, those of us who are here today, as well as those who will be joining us as they see this recorded session. As Adam was saying, sort of part of the response that we are aiming at for the education of immigrant origin kids and their peers and the public more broadly is one that is pretty integrated. Essentially, what we're looking for is to create a new way of thinking about, an integrated way of thinking about the teaching and learning of migration and teaching and learning for a world on the move that pays attention to really important components. So, for example, we know that we need to get to understand our children. We know we need to reframe, for many of us, the ideas, conceptions, misconceptions that we have about deficit models of the immigrant origin child. So there's a lot of work that we need to do around how we get to understand, get to meet the children with whom we work, the assets they bring, the capacity to straddle between cultures, between languages, and so forth. We also think that we need to think a little bit more deeply about, or renew our thinking about, what is it that we're aiming for? What kind of learning are we actually after? And here, Adam and I have been working on this frame of really looking at what are the long-lasting habits of mind or dispositions that might be particularly relevant for a world on the move. Dispositions such as perspective taking and empathy, and really integrating our social-emotional interactions with others with a deep understanding and a desire to inquire about issues of migration. So perspective taking, inquiry, that disposition to communicate across differences, across languages, across religious affiliations, across ideologies, a disposition to detect injustices, inequities, and to be able to name them, to see them when they appear as invisible, and to have sort of a sensibility towards them. A disposition towards taking action. And this is something that Adam has been working on for many, many years, sort of the notion of really participating in the civic sphere. So thinking about learning, the kind of long-lasting learning, deep learning that we're looking for is an invitation. It's something that we'll be talking about in these seminars. There's another component, another dimension of rethinking education for a world on the move that has to do with how we create learning environments that are inclusive, that are welcoming, that really allow every child and every adult to live to the fullest of their potential. And here, I know that would be tweeting and distributing some of the newest thinking. Adam and Carola have been working on some frameworks around some of these ideas. And here we probably will be needing to pay attention to how do we make diversity visible? How do we get to know everybody as people, not just as the teacher or the student in the school? How do we really build trusting relationships? What does that mean? How do we hold high expectations for what all children can learn? Two more dimensions that we're sort of inviting ourselves and others to rethink. Professional growth. One of the things that we see in professional development is how important it is, or it has become, for professional development to be personal, to begin with who we are, and to really aim at reframing not only the content that we teach, but who we are and why, our sense of purpose in our profession, our sense of values and mission as well. So really important opportunities for rethinking education that migration brings to the table. Today we'll be talking about one of them, the fifth one that I wanted to bring up for us, and this is rethinking how migration is taught and how it appears in schools and in our curriculum. And in particular, we really need to be rethinking how we build a larger narrative about human migration that would allow, that would be capacious enough for children and for adults and for all of us to sort of fit in, even with our a narrative that allows for contradictions, for tensions, and so forth, but one that is not fragmented, as Adam was suggesting a little bit earlier, not just what happens in 8th grade or what happens in 6th grade in the month of December, but really a narrative that invites us all to be. So to get us started with this thinking, I would love to invite us to look very, very closely. We're going to do it at Project Zero. We describe as a thinking routine, and we have and at Reimagining sort of a collection that we particularly like. So I'd love to invite us to take a close look at this image, the image of the encounter of two groups of people. And we are going to use the chat to respond to a few questions. So I'd love for you to scan the image. Perhaps you can focus on the upper left quadrant. Look for detail. What do you see here as you look closely? And notice the things that you see, and please share some keywords on the chat. What do you see? I see people with hands extended forward on the left side of the image.
Karen says open arms from one group. Poppy says two groups of people. Arrows and hands. People welcoming others, Elena says. An eagle with a flag. Anybody know what that eagle is? Hebrew letters, eagles, flag, script, symbolism, Natalie says. Ryake, two eagles with flags, Hebrew message, different cultures, Simon says.
Keep looking and look closely, look at the expressions.
I'd read in Spanish, but you'd mock my accent. Luggage carried seems very basic. Statue of Liberty in the background.
Yes.
People on the right seem stressed. The eagles seemed engaged in a confrontation. Oh, that's interesting. Carrying their belongings, Angela says. Separation, water between people, movement of ships.
Okay. Anything else? I see people carrying bags, or I notice differences in the clothing of people as well.
Elena picks that up, yes. Outstretched arms, brighter colors on the left, absolutely. 1909, where did you see that, Donna? Very clever. Warm clothes.
Okay. So we're going to move and linger a little bit on this question.
Karen says people of European descent. I just wanted to make sure you heard that.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to pose the questions that this image raises for us. What questions come to mind as you look closely at this image? Briefly, while you do that, I'll exit the full view so that I can see your chat.
If you want, I can keep reading. There's a barrier. How can they reach the other side? The face expression on the left is a little odd. Immigration, Simon says. Boats, movement to sea in the waves. Where are the people on the right coming from? Catherine wants to know. There's no bridge. Ona points out. Those on the left are welcoming ones on the right. Why, where, when, who questions? I wonder why they're stepping on the two rocks with water in the middle. Welcoming or sending away? Abby wants to know, who are they? I'm reading it like a children's book. Assimilation of appearance, old world appearance, Donna said. Who produced this image? And why? Why'd they do that? Sadness, hope, misplacement. What does a banner say? I wonder if they're earlier immigrants in fancier clothes and more recent in the older looking clothes. Are the people on the left really welcoming? What's the meaning of the Hebrew message? What were the push-pull factors, Jessica wants to know, in people leaving their home? What are the reasons that people on the left want to welcome people on the right? Is this propaganda? Why the people on the left don't extend their hands? What's the flag in the background, Cher? Do a reverse image search and you can find it. Um, why would they want to cross? That's a great question. What is waiting on the other side?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. These are fabulous, fabulous questions, and we're going to move to some connections, connections that you might be able to draw between sort of the image and your own teaching, your own school context, or your own museum context, or whatever it is that you work. What connections do you see? What to say? Connections between what you see, what you notice, what this image is making you think about, and your context.
How do we welcome our own students? Elena wants to know. It's a great connection. Exploring migratory experiences across time and region, Sonia notes. I live in a port. I've grown up to such images, Kyriaki says. Hi, Kyriaki.
Mm-hmm.
Cher says, immigration is complicated, takes compassion. Connections to bigger stories, Natalie says. Poppy says, in Greece, this is familiar. Maybe no connection because nowadays people don't welcome, Angela says. What's the baggage? And how can we learn its importance? Are we facilitating inclusion in our classroom by sharing and showing a welcoming attitude? I wonder if my children, who are mostly immigrant, feel welcomed when they entered the US. It's not enough to extend the hand. One needs to engage deeper, build the bridges. Puts me in the mind of newly arrived immigrant origin students. It looks like the Mediterranean Sea today. And the classroom builds bridges. The water is a border. The water is transportation. How are we welcoming others? Michaela wants to know. I wonder how this would look if it was the Asian Pacific perspective with Angel Island. Absolutely, very important to that connection in a second. Lots of movement. New arrival seems sad, welcomers stoic. Although this is an old image, nothing, I'm thinking Kyriaki is going to say, has changed. The identity and change and what does home look like? My students forget their family roots as a result of migration, Yurko says. Connection, the stories, and the reasons for immigration. From Raquel.
So what's fascinating about this comment, your observations is, is how much a single image can really open up sort of a variety of dimensions of migration. And clearly we're working with a very, very experienced group here. But I'm wondering when sort of curiosity emerges about, what is this image? Where is it coming from? What exactly is it depicting? What period is this happening? And I'm wondering, Adam, would you like to share a little bit about what you contextualize this moment?
Sure, of course. Or Donna gets credit though, because Donna was like looking so carefully at this at the image and found the year that I didn't see earlier. So just a little bit of context. So between 1881 and 1924, about 2 million Eastern European Jews came to the United States, mainly from Russia, but those borders, right, changed for a very, very, very long time. I love it, Donna, history nerd. Yes, me too. There's a question of how much these folks were pushed or pulled, right, in these conversations. The folks in Eastern Europe, where Jews are coming from. This was a Jewish New Year's card. These folks were pretty poor. Didn't mean that they made a lot of money when they came to the United States, but there was a real sense that leaving would make a big difference. As a matter of fact, you'll see that Jews are coming in this card, men and women together. Jews, more than other groups, tend to come in the whole families because there really wasn't a place for them back at home. A little bit of context in the Eagles. The eagle with the U.S. colors, the quote is from Psalms, and I couldn't have read this, but I did read the translation. It says, "Shelter us in the shadow of your wing," from Psalms, so from the Hebrew Bible. So just the last context that I'll do in the particular, and is that, well, many of these folks who are coming were religious. Many were not. And so you can see the sort of the clothing changes is not only part of this Americanization, which was very much pushed at the time, but it also there was an opportunity to create a new identity for yourself in these communities in the United States. From context, so Cher points out exactly right. So here we are. If this image is from 1909, that's not long after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, where there was absolutely no welcome for Chinese immigrants. A part of a really strong anti-immigrant society that was really starting to build up. Actually, it started with Asians, but as Erica Lee will point out, the anti-Asian movement led to the creation of national immigration restrictions. Ellis Island, which we don't think of often in that context, is actually built that way as part of the federal enforcement of immigration. And of course, there's also two other important migrations going on. This is also the time of the Great Migration of African Americans to the North that ended up, all told, about 6 million people leaving the South. And it was at the time when, as westward expansion continued forcing American Indians off their native lands, right? So stories of forced migrations happening at the same time. So just a broad context for some of this image, and I'll shut up for a little bit.
Yeah. So, so when we think about migration, so we have that perspective, Adam, and thank you for that, because you not only sort of contextualize the particular source, but also sort of have to see sort of the stories behind these individuals depicted here, and the stories that are not depicted in the image, that are also coinciding, not always in the same direction, as you mentioned. Ellis Island and Angel Island have very different stories about different versions of what receiving immigrant communities might look like. And when we think about it, sort of we're permanently encountering stories of migration, whether it is through the arts, whether it is in the news, whether it is as an invitation to respond to the Muslim, quote unquote, Muslim ban. So we're permanently, the thing about migration is that it is so ubiquitous, it is so complex, it is so multidimensional, and it appears, as much as it is framing our experience in our everyday lives, it is at the same time being taught in schools in pretty fragmented ways, as we were saying a little bit earlier today. So the questions that we asked ourselves in thinking about how to represent this enormous story that we breathe in and breathe out as we walk through our cities and as we travel, as we consume and so forth, this story of interdependence, the story of human encounters. We ask ourselves, what does it mean to understand human migration in order to live in a world on the move? What do we mean by understanding? How do we make sense? Is understanding just a matter of having sort of the information, or really sort of aiming for something that's deeper? And here, a little bit earlier, I was sharing with you sort of these long-lasting dispositions, habits of mind, that we might want to develop, but also powerful questions that might frame our encounter with new moments of migration. How can we teach about a phenomenon that is this complex, this ubiquitous, this politicized, this emotionally charged, so systemic, and at the same time perennial? Where do we start the story of human migration? What is the beginning? And how do we address this complexity in a way that feels accessible for us and for others? What matters most ultimately for our young people, for educators, and for the public at large to understand about human migration, past, present, and its future? So it were questions like this that led us to think about what sort of a reasonable response might be, a reasonable frame might be for our teaching of human migration. And we thought, and this is something that has been very much part of our thinking. We thought perhaps the best way, stop sharing for a second, that perhaps the best way for us to be thinking about preparing young people to understand migration is not just to have really powerful cases like the one that we just saw that Adam was describing for us. It's perhaps not just about understanding particular dynamics, but perhaps the most profound legacy that we can leave in our curriculum about migration is to prepare kids and ourselves to ask powerful questions. It's to prepare ourselves to ask the questions that would actually reveal distinctions and nuances that are important to understand migration. So it's about looking at the past and asking questions very much like the ones that you proposed. You know, why do people leave their homes? What is the interest in people receiving others, you know, to actually receiving them? Is this propaganda? Is this not propaganda? So it's really, so how do we frame sort of what is the intention behind the framing of stories of migration? These kinds of questions enable us to encounter a new case of migration and find our way through it, so to speak. I was thinking about this as we were trying to make sense of the situation with the COVID pandemic. We have sort of a flood of information that is so many times overwhelming, confusing, fear-generating, manipulated, and so forth. What would it look like to have a series of guiding questions, such as, how do these viruses cause disease? What have other countries done in order to improve the conditions, to level the curve? Having guiding questions of this kind, that we call them revealing questions of this kind, is the bet or the idea behind the what we call the learning arc. Let me share again. Yeah. So the Reimagine Migration Learning Arc, let me see. Can you see? Can you see my screen? There you go. So the Reimagine Migration Learning Arc sort of is composed, if you wish, of three main moments in a journey to try to understand this phenomenon of migration. First is a personal moment of sharing stories. Then there's a deepening moment of understanding migration, understanding the life that took place before migration occurred, understanding the very journey of migration, understanding forms of adjustment. And then we finish this the journey with the notion of, you know, turning to action, essentially, because an understanding of migration that is only intellectual is probably not enough, you know, for us to prepare young people for the lives of today. So let me unpack this a little bit for us and see if we can. Let's see, for some reason this is not moving. Oh, there you go. So when it comes to moving stories, so if you think about the learning arc as a collection of powerful questions, or collection of questions that might serve as a lens or as a compass for us to be thinking about this phenomenon. One of the things that is real is that we all have a story of migration. What is mine? What is yours? And sharing stories of migration makes sort of the entry into this exploration a personal one, an empathetic one. We may have stories of migration because we migrated, but we also have stories of migration because somebody else migrated. We might have stories of migration of our ancestors as the borders in the south and in the United States crossed over the heads of what we now call Latinos, you know, who lived there at the time, sort of as the borders and the frontiers expanded. So as we may have stories of migration that have to do with, forced migration, our own, as well as that of our ancestors or grandparents, family members. And these stories of migration may be sitting, may be told from a multiplicity of perspectives. When we think about stories of migration, perhaps the question there is, how do we learn from these stories? How can we make some of the stories that are invisible more visible? And how can we approach them listening very carefully? How can we both learn to tell the stories as well as learn to listen carefully, empathically? Moving stories, and here, imagine we have like an app that Carola Suarez-Orozco and others have developed that allows young people to interview one another, asking some of these questions and reflecting about stories. And in the chat today, we have several of you. So I'm thinking about Jessica, who's doing. Oh, there you go. I'm thinking about Jessica, who's doing really powerful work on storytelling, story sharing of immigrant origin youth, as well as youth who don't view themselves as immigrant origin. So moving stories.
You should know that Donna from Louisville used the moving stories work in her class as well, and she's.
That's great. That is really, really great. And I think that this too, when we think about our own education as as professionals, beginning with our own stories and bringing ourselves as full people on the table, is I think is really an important direction for us to move into. So thinking about then understanding migration, most of the times in which we've asked folks to try to classify or organize, stories of migration. Sort of, it tends to have this arc of, something happened before migration, then the journey came, and then adjustment took place in the new land. And several of the questions that we have articulated here come from some of the literature on sort of migration studies, and we're really striving for the very contemporary literature sort of in this case as well. So take for instance the notion of life before migration, and the very, very question of where do we put the once upon a time moment of the story. And here in the work that we're doing, we're looking at the origins of humans, our origins as human beings, of early humans as a collective origin, if you wish. What was life before the journey also sort of invites a variety of opportunities for us to understand the normalcy of life before the journey took place, both whether the journey is from Central America to the United States, or from Europe at the time, or from Syria to Greece, as Kyriaki understands so well. Why do people leave their homes? And we're going to dig a little bit into this, in a moment. The journey being sort of also sort of a powerful invitation for us to be thinking about. And what's interesting here is that so many of these questions are, in a way, sort of natural language questions, or questions that are like human questions for us to ask ourselves. And yet there's an enormous amount of literature behind sort of each one of them, enormous amount of work being done behind each one of them. So for example, so the question of, what do people experience as they move, from one place to another, sort of how much autonomy do they have, how much autonomy or how much choice do they actually have at different moments in the journey? How are, as we saw in that image, how are their identities being shaped? What do they encounter? How do borders impact people's lives? What happens? How do we position ourselves on one or another side of a border? And what happens in what is now sort of a really interesting area of work, which is what happens in the borderlines? What happens at that mixture? What happens in these communities that live, across borders? So what happens at that point of intersection where we get to learn each other's language, and we get to exchange, we get to trade and to interact. How do individuals and societies navigate the spaces in between? Here, what we're looking into too is the is the legal framework. What is, what are our norms around around understanding belonging, if you wish. What are our norms? Who's responsible for the people who are in the in-betweens? And what are the principles, the moral, the ethical principles that would make us help us make a decision about who belongs and who might not, or how do we frame belonging?
Just just a contemporary connection in the States, it's been a very interesting conversation about what is our moral obligation to first responders when 29% of the doctors in the United States are immigrant origin. Many of the nurses are folks who are in the middle of applying for citizenship status. There's I believe 66,000 healthcare workers on DACA. So how do the situations that we're living in reawaken the civic questions of migration?
That's it. Yeah, that's it. And then, and in terms of preparing young people, what are the opportunities that we give them, right? So to really think about the universes of responsibility. I mean, who do I take care of, and who is part of my sort of my group of belonging, so to speak. So it's a powerful opportunity for human development, sort of in a deep sense. And then the important questions about adjustment, about the new land, so to speak. And so it's that have to do with the conditions. We know that sort of the conditions in the arrival of the integration, and by integration we mean what Mary Waters describes as the change in the mutual adaptation, mutual change of both the newcomers and the old timers, so to speak. So what are the conditions in this new land that would allow for that integration to happen in better ways? What is the economic situation? What is the situation of jobs? What are the media stories that are dominating the public narratives about migration and migrant people? And how do these particular local cases that we might study and that we might be experiencing, Kyriaki, you're working at a very, very important frontier in this area in Greece. I know, Mika, you're working, with an enormous influx of Venezuelan families in Buenos Aires, Argentina. So we have sort of all of these local cases in a way are connected to sort of larger global patterns. So this is also sort of an opportunity for kids to understand, to compare, to try to draw some commonalities, differences, and understand. And again, sort of, we can imagine sort of young people developing the capacity to ask these questions when confronted with a new case. It is not the same to say, how many people cross the border every day, than to ask what are the conditions in the new land, right? Or how forced or non-forced are these crossings.
And Veronica, that's very much the story in the image that you chose, right? To get people started. I mean, one way of reading that image is that the folks on the left have been in the States for a while, and they're dressed differently, not just because they may have more money, because they're adapting new identities.
Exactly. You and I were debating about the fact that sort of this image was used for a New Year's card and New Year's postcard, and we're thinking, well, does it mean that the postcard was produced in September, which is like the New Year's, just New Year's, or was it produced in December? And so again, so how do we adopt in different different practices, different cultural. And how is the contribution sort of recognized? Right? So it's also very, very interesting. So take, for example, the question of why people leave their homes, which is a question that kids have. So here, sort of, as we continue to unpack, questions that might help us sort of find a way around this problem space. We might invite kids, we might invite ourselves to try to understand, what is. So you have underneath there sort of the quote unquote caravan, image of, folks from the central American triangle coming up, to the United States, and this is again not unique. But here it would matter quite a bit to try to understand sort of the larger societal political and the environmental forces. When we think about people coming from Guatemala, when we think about people going to Europe from Syria, in fact, it is the drying of the land in rural Guatemala, the drying of the land in Syria, that leaves people to move to the cities. And in the case of Syria, or in the case of Guatemala, sort of in under conditions of very sort of weak states, very fragile states, very fragile sort of democracies, in which case sort of the polarization and sort of violence and conflict emerges with multiple external influences. In the case of Syria, for instance, or actually in the case of Guatemala and Latin America as well, sort of what seems like an internal conflict is actually sort of the theater for battles, geopolitical battles that are much, much larger than the particulars of, the city in Guatemala or Damascus. And then that leads people to hop on a boat or to pick their families and come up to try to find sort of a safer life, a safer place. So what's interesting there is the possibility of combining sort of the larger societal, environmental, political forces with the more intimate work, and this is the work of Debris, who's been looking at the decisions and how decisions are made sort of in the family about leaving. What are the particulars, the contextual moments in which a family decides? Is it the father? Is it the mother? And it's typically the case that not everybody agrees. So even the distinction between push and pull, force and force, it's once we look at it in more detail, we see the nuance in all of this. Another sort of piece to consider in thinking about why people leave their homes has to do with the dynamics with cell phones, with internet connections, with travel being more available. We have a transformation and a mutual influence that is very much part of the norm, the everyday life, so to speak, of interaction. So it is really no longer the case that, it is not the case that, that people are, the voyage is a one-directional arrow from place A to place B, but it is much, much more a situation of, transnationality, of belonging to multiple places, to, rooted cosmopolitanism, if you wish, by which we learn, adults learn, and children learn to exist in multiple worlds at once. Particularly like so what you see in those maps is like the fragile states, the darker the state in the north, in the first map, the more fragile, and it's also sort of underneath is the vulnerability to climate change. So here we see sort of a convergence in many cases of political and environmental and economic forces that are creating the conditions for people to leave. Now this is also sort of a terrific opportunity for young people to develop the capacity to think about complex causality. And so it's not just one cause that gets people to leave. It's not just that they come for our jobs, quote unquote, but it is a much, much, much more complex picture. It is an opportunity for kids to really look at nuances, look at unintended consequences of decisions, looking at sort of apparent apparent patterns, and then sort of digging a little bit deeper. One image that I particularly like, which my friend Carol Wilson shared with us, is a stamp that you see over there, and that is something called, like, I think it's the rooftop beach or something like that. Asphalt rooftop beaches, like Puerto Ricans in New York, going to the beach and the rooftops, and what I think is really very, very powerful is how this gets sent back to to Puerto Rico, to expanding the imagination of what is possible and how people live in this other place. That so when we think about why people leave their homes, we have this very amazing opportunity, as in the other questions that we have in the arc, to really not only make this a matter of social studies, but also of art, also of psychology, also of environmental sciences, and so forth. So again, sort of the arc aims at really inviting and being capacious in the questions that capacious enough to invite multiple disciplinary perspectives. So I'm just gonna, so we talked a little bit about this before, so I'm gonna just finish with the question of turning to action, which is that sort of third act, if you wish, in the learning arc. And here we draw quite a bit on some of the work that Danielle Allen has been doing and in this area, as well as sort of civics education broadly. But essentially, the questions that we're thinking about here is how is it that we can really engage sort of ourselves, the motivations and the desire to, and the concern and the sort of the anger that sort of, and the causes that the issues about migration that young people care about, and why. How can we draw on models, people in the past, how have people in the past resolved some of these these issues, and then sort of the invitation for young people to really use their voice, their stories, their writing, their filming, their art, as well as their actions, and recognizing in particular the spheres of influence from the small. I will bring this topic up, quote unquote, in a conversation, to the larger. I will organize, political participation for the next election. So that's in a way sort of completes sort of a sense of the three moments in the art. There are a few qualities that I would like to point our attention to. One is the fact that we're aiming for this art to be quite to make complexity accessible by virtue of representing a complex problem in the form of questions to inquire. We're imagining it being very much a matter of framing. We're envisioning it as an art that invites a very personal connection with migration, as well as an art that, in a way, makes complexity accessible, as I was saying a little bit earlier. We also envision it being very modular, if you wish. So you can just pick a few of these questions. You don't need to sort of cover it all, so to speak. But what we see in the ways in which people are using the arc is that many times, even if it's a few lessons, people tend to have a personal piece, and they tend to have at least a vision for action at the end, and there's some understanding sort of in the middle. So we see that as a pattern, so to speak. Now, what does this have to do with curriculum design? And this is a beautiful graph that Adam sort of designed. Is really, we envision sort of a reimagining migration approach to curriculum design as borrowing from the arc, looking into the kinds of resources and lessons, and Adam will talk about this in a moment, the kinds of resources and lessons and images and so forth that can be used in order to teach, respond, or address some of these, explore some of these questions, and attention to these deeply seated dispositions or habits of mind and the types of pedagogies and what we call thinking routines that might be able to generate them. The dispositions and thinking routines is something that we're eager to hold another seminar, like webinar on. You got a little bit of an example in the earlier one. So I think that is it, Adam, and how about I pass it on to you?
Absolutely. So thanks, Veronica. That was really helpful, I think, to start to build and take us down one particular road. So one thing I want to make visible as we're doing a transition, what we're doing is we're talking a lot about the resources that we've developed and the material and the larger frame. Any resource, any decision for content, any bit of teaching is always taking place in relationship with the students who are in our classroom, within the communities in which we teach, within the schools and culture of our school buildings. Sometimes we're supporting it, sometimes we may be working differently. And then, of course, within the academic disciplines that we're teaching. So we're making suggestions, but it's that negotiation, right? It's that adaptation that makes curriculum come alive. It's not, oh, I'm going to take something wholehearted, and just adapt it wholesale. That's very much not our approach. our approach is that negotiation, and we want to work with you to support that work. So that said, I am going to introduce some resources. We think of ourselves as both creators of resources, but curators of good stuff too. So if you know stuff that we should know, tell us, right? There's a real, what the best part of my job is, there's an unbelievable spirit of collaboration here at Reimagining Migration. We want to collaborate with other people who are doing good work, and we hope that they want to collaborate with us too. So let me introduce you to some of the content that we've curated, and just as to give you the sense on how to find this stuff. So hey, this is a homepage of our website, and look at that, the world is still moving despite the fact that COVID seems to have gotten us in a lockdown. So the website is organized under 3 drop downs. The first one is really organizational, who the heck we are. The second piece is really foundational, which is a lot of what Veronica started to walk through here today. So Veronica was talking about our learning framework is where she kicked off. Oops, I didn't expect that to take us there. Our learning framework is where she began our conversation. My computer is really slow all of a sudden. And then goes to the learning arc. I do not know why it's being so slow, but there is the learning arc, and you can find the graphic. What I think is important is Veronica gave you one top level. If you click for the text version of the questions for the learning arc, there's actually very deep questions written out all the way through. So I do suggest that you spend some time taking a look at it, printing it out. We've just revised it last week because we're learning. We're a learning organization. So what we do is, well, you'll find a lot of this stuff ranging from information about professional development to the thinking routines that we talked about. You'll find a page explaining our teaching and curriculum work, which again, we're sort of talking to you about, but go to this page on the site, because it's here where you can start to explore some of these ideas in a little bit more depth here, from the graphic, okay, to looking more at the learning arc, to thinking about the dispositions of resources, and then again, how do you start to teach them? You can just break any of this down for a little bit more information. And then we do a lot of our job is collecting stuff to teach. So it's the content is aligned to the learning arc. I've been spending the afternoon updating the website. See, Veronica, it's green. It wasn't green earlier. And it's laid out with the questions, and then you'll find resources and lesson plans and blogs that are all meant to support this kind of teaching. They're great resources here all the way through. One of the things I'll make a gesture towards here is the Moving Stories Educator Guide, which is the storytelling project that Veronica mentioned earlier. Let me move to the second piece of the learning arc, which is about understanding migration. And so again, this is a 3-part story: life before migration, the journey, and adjustment. So I've curated the material by those different sections. So if you go into the life before migration section, there's actually again, here's the questions that we're exploring in this area. And there's some really great resources that we've been adding, and we will continue to add stuff all the time. The one that I'm kind of fascinated with is, you'll see this Li Chu story. It's a 1903 story of a Chinese immigrant describing life in his town, his village in the Canton province of China before he came to the United States. So that's just one piece of this. As you saw, that it's broken down into all different pieces of this, the journey, the ecology of adjustment, the adjustment stories. Again, there's really, really rich resources here. And then I think what I want to do is just make sure you see some of the action stuff, though. Oh, excuse me, I went to the wrong page because I'm just tired. So go to the turning to action. Faster. And my absolute favorite story to teach that we've been looking at the last couple of years is the story on the far left. The stories of 15-year-old Mexican-American, primarily Mexican-American, not entirely Mexican-American women who were protesting a show me your papers law in Texas. And so what they did is they kind of reenacted a cultural ceremony, reenacted their quinceañera, but used the quinceañera as a political protest. And it is an amazing story about political activism and how 15-year-olds, too young to vote. I don't know if how many, you know, the song Summertime Blues, where the guy said, I'd like to help your son, but you're too young to vote. These young girls are too young to vote, and some of them are undocumented, so may not even be able to vote, right? And yet it's a story of it really making a difference. So that's that. There's a lot of stuff here on the website. I wanted to introduce you this, not just take you through content as much as to say, here's how do you find this stuff. That said, while I'm looking, the civic challenges in uncertain times reading is really helpful. There's stuff that's a week old here, looking at, you know, stuff is in response to COVID-19, right next to some really classic stuff, very intentionally classic stuff to play with our notion of who actually owns this history. So right next to the story of Emma Lazarus, the poet who wrote The New Colossus. So I'm going to shut up, but I want to thank you all for spending time with us this afternoon. I think it was, at least we're hoping that what we've given you is some skills to start to look at how do you start to organize content thematically using questions to build some comparative discussions around issues of migration. So Veronica, you want to add a last word before we say goodbye to all these lovely people?
Yeah. So I think that sort of one piece to share is that is how important it is for us to be in dialogue with you, to be in dialogue with practitioners, with everybody who's, you know, folks who are teaching in the classrooms, and to we continue to try out ideas. Right now, we're collaborating with the Smithsonian Learning Lab on a museum collection around some of these ideas. So pretty soon, we suspect that in the Summer Institute that we hope you join us for, we'll see some elements of that. So this work happens at the intersection of teaching in classrooms, of museum education, of cultural institutions, as well as in our homes nowadays, and through Zoom. So we're very, very grateful that you're here. Please
Great.
continue to do this work and share.
And the last pitch is that we're doing an online seminar this summer, July 13th through the 16th. I will make sure that you get information about it in the follow-up email from today. We'd love for y'all to attend. It's very low cost, but there are scholarships and fellowships available if you're interested in deeper engagement with the organization. Today it's a webinar, so we did a little bit more talking at you, although Veronica did facilitate some engagement. I promise this is going to be a very, very highly interactive online seminar. We've been paying a lot of attention to best practices teaching online, and look forward to spending some of that with you. All right, y'all, thank you so much. Say goodbye in the chat. Look for an evaluation, look for information about the summer seminar, and look for the PowerPoint and a few links. Have a beautiful, wonderful afternoon, and continue to be healthy.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
And I'll make sure to save the chat.